Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a genuinely epic 6,000-year history that is entirely framed by one thing, an inevitable apocalyptic destiny. We're going to map out the complete chronological history of the Witcher world, and honestly, once you understand this grand timeline, it completely changes how you view literally every event that happens within it.
Right, so let's jump right in. We actually have to start at the end, with the haunting words of the elven diviner Ithlinne. She predicted something called the White Frost, which is basically an all-encompassing, unrelenting ice age. This dark prophecy hangs over every single bloody century of the continent's existence. It's the inescapable endpoint of this world, meaning every war, every magical mutation, every royal lineage, it's all just a desperate struggle against a ticking cosmic clock.
So to figure out how the world actually reaches this frozen brink, we need to wind the clock way back. Looking at the grand timeline, it's kind of wild to realize just how briefly humans have even been in the picture. For millennia, we're talking thousands of years, the continent enjoyed a real golden age of the elder races. You had gnomes, dwarves, and elves living in relative harmony, building grand cities, and peacefully shaping the wildlands.
But, that beautiful tranquility didn't last. It was utterly shattered by an absolute cosmic nightmare known as the conjunction of the spheres. Happening around the 2030s before Resurrection, this was a massive, multiverse-shattering cataclysm. Imagine different realms literally colliding in a violent maelstrom of energy. It formed these unnatural bridges between worlds that were never, ever supposed to touch, and it trapped a whole host of terrifying creatures right here on the continent.
The sheer whiplash the world experienced here is staggering. Before the conjunction, the Aen Seidhe elves were constructing magnificent, peaceful cities like Loch Moyni. But after, the world was flipped upside down. Almost overnight, the elder races had to figure out how to cope with vampires, ghouls, graveyears, not to mention this untamed primal magic known as chaos. Oh, and they also had to deal with primitive, strange new human tribes like the Dock and the Wasgor.
Now, while those early tribes kind of mingled at first, the true point of no return hit centuries later in the 760s. This era is known as the First Landing. This is when the militaristic human ancestors, the Nordlings, arrived across the Great Ocean at the Yaruga River. Their arrival? Yeah, that marked the absolute end of any peaceful cohabitation. They launched a relentless, incredibly bloody expansion, aggressively slaughtering the elves, razing their famed cities to the ground, and just building their own kingdoms right on top of the ruins.
But listen, this aggressive human expansion came with a terrifying price tag. Their newly built settlements were constantly being hunted by the lingering monstrous relics left over from the conjunction. And let's be real, regular humans were completely ill-equipped to fight the superhuman strength of these beasts. So surrounded by otherworldly horrors and lethal magic, how on earth did humanity avoid total extinction?
Well, to survive, humanity turned to some incredibly dark magic and mutation. The mages, Alzur, his master Cosimo, and his apprentice Idoran managed to secure royal funding at Ristberg Castle. What did they do? They engineered a brutal, magical mutation process specifically designed to create superhuman monster hunters. They experimented on kidnapped children, subjecting them to agonizing genetic changes. Eventually, they relocated the survivors to Morgreg Castle to formally establish the Order of Witchers.
And the human toll for this was absolutely staggering. Out of the first 38 children they experimented on, only 5 boys actually survived the agonizingly lethal process. Just 5. But those 5 survivors possessed the superhuman speed, stamina, and magic that humanity desperately needed to finally push back the monsters of the conjunction.
Now, that original Order of Witchers didn't exactly stay united for long. As their numbers slowly grew, they fractured into distinct schools spread all over the continent. Arnagod split off to form the Solitary Bear School. Ivar, Evil Eye, founded the Viper School to study the Wild Hunt. Iwan took the Manticores down to Zerrikania. The Cat School under Gesras evolved into these emotionally volatile assassins. Erland founded the noble, knight-like Griffins. And the remnants of that original order, they became the Wolf School, setting up their headquarters at the mountain fortress of Kaer Morhen.
These mutant knights were incredibly effective at their jobs. But here's the tragic irony. As the monster population dwindled over the centuries, human gratitude quickly curdled into xenophobic fear. This growing hatred was perfectly captured in the infamous Anonymous Monstrum pamphlet. It was a vicious piece of propaganda that showed exactly how humanity had come to view their saviors, not as heroes anymore, but as diabolic, unnatural creations that needed to be exterminated.
And this hatred didn't just stay on the page either.
It ignited bloody, incredibly violent pogroms. Paralyzed by fear, peasants, actually aided by mages, marched on Witcher fortresses. They sacked Kaer Morhen, slaughtered most of the Wolf School, and crucially, they burned the actual knowledge required to create new Witchers. The few survivors were scattered, doomed to be a dying breed in a world that increasingly despised them.
Okay, let's switch gears for a second. Because while humanity was busy fighting monsters in the mud and then eventually turning on the Witchers, the Elves were playing a much, much longer game. They had quietly orchestrated a massive, multi-generational genetic breeding program to harness something known as the Elder Blood, or Henny Eicher. This specific gene grants its possessor immense, truly unparalleled magical control over space and time. It essentially allows them to traverse dimensions at will.
And this brings us to a massive, world-altering pivot point. The Elven plan was highly calculated. Breed a savior capable of opening the Ard Gaith, the great temporal portal, to literally save their race from the impending white frost. But their absolute control slipped away entirely, all because of a human variable. The Elven carrier of this crucial gene, Lara Dorren, completely rejected her intended Elven partner. Instead, she chose a human mage, Creganon of Lode.
By doing this, Lara Dorren passed this unbelievably powerful gene directly into human royalty, which kicked off a volatile genetic arms race. You end up with direct carriers like Queen Calanthe, Princess Pavetta, and eventually Ciri, alongside activator genes in figures like Adalia. This bloodline became so coveted and so incredibly muddled that it even tied into Falca's rebellion. That was a bloody peasant uprising led by a disinherited princess whose exact genetic link to the Elder Blood is still fiercely debated by historians today. Basically, the destiny of the continent's royalty became intrinsically tied to this one, immensely powerful bloodline.
So, as you can imagine, this scramble for power, territory, and control over such a massive genetic destiny naturally erupted into all-out war. Enter the Northern Wars. Dominating the 13th century, this was a devastating series of geopolitical conflicts. Whether you trace the very start to the annexation of Ebbing in 1239 or the brutal Battle of Marnadal in 1263, this era completely, utterly redefined the borders and the bloodlines of the entire continent.
Driving this massive conflict was the Nilfgaardian Empire, pushing up from the south. Emperor Emthyr var Emreis marched north with an unprecedented, frankly terrifying troop strength of over 320,000 soldiers. To put that into perspective, it was a highly disciplined, unified imperial force, the likes of which the northern kingdoms had never, ever faced before.
The resulting conflict was incredibly complex. Just a sheer clash of massive, desperate factions. You had the Black Cloaks of Nilfgaard pushing upward. Against them stood the northern kingdoms, fielding over 100,000 troops, united out of pure desperation, sure, but still highly fractious, led by monarchs like Foltest, Vizimir II, and Calanthe. And caught right in the middle, leveraging the chaos, were the Scoia'tael. These were elven and dwarven guerrilla fighters launching unconventional, brutal resistance strikes.
And the resulting landscape? Pushed to the absolute brink. The wars yielded incredible bloodshed and basically societal collapse. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers fell apart, ultimately replaced by secret magic lodges. The sheer paranoia of this unending conflict triggered vicious non-human pogroms and horrific witch hunts. The continent was fundamentally shattered, just steeped in ash, mud, and endless political maneuvering.
But as we look at the ruin of these human empires, we are pulled right back to exactly where we started, Ithlinne's prophecy. Amidst all the chaos of the Northern Wars, the focus ultimately zeroes in on the Swallow, the foretold child of Elder Blood. This incredibly powerful descendant of Lara Dorren is said to be the only one who can actually face the impending doom of the White Frost and open the door to salvation.
So, I want to leave you with this to ponder. When we look at this entire 6,000-year history, the arrival of the monsters, the brutal human expansion, Alzur creating the Witchers, the genetic tampering of the Elves, and the endless bloodshed of the Northern Wars, was all of this just a fatalistic, chaotic march toward an unavoidable icy apocalypse? Or was it the necessary, brutal crucible required to forge the continent's ultimate savior? It's a fascinating question for sure, and one that makes the lore of this world utterly unforgettable.